It's Air Talk. I'm Larry Mantle. So good to have you with us. Of course, you know, every day we check in for the very latest on COVID-19. Today, our authority, Dr. Dean Blumberg, UC Davis Children's Hospital, where he's Chief of Pediatric Infectious Diseases and Professor of Medicine at UC Davis. Dr. Blumberg, a very good Monday to you. Hope you had a nice weekend.
Yeah, I did. Thank you, Larry. Good morning to you, too.
We're seeing good news here in Southern California as cases of COVID-19 continue their decline. How are things looking in the greater Sacramento area?
Pretty similar. Things look really good in California relative to the rest of the country. We're seeing a real plateauing of the number of cases from the latest surge that we saw in the late summer. So things are settling down.
All right. We have mandates, of course, for school vaccination. As you're aware, Governor Newsom on Friday said that as vaccines get full FDA approval, students will be expected to take those vaccines before they are allowed back into the classroom. There are exceptions for personal beliefs at this point. That's pending the legislature stepping in, and it could pass something that does away with personal beliefs. But under the governor's order, that would still be an out for parents who don't want to get their kids vaccinated. And then 3,000 miles away in New York City, Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor denied an appeal from a group of New York City teachers of their vaccine mandate for the teaching staff. Your thoughts on where we stand with these school mandates?
I think that one of the important things to realize is that the vast majority of people who need to be vaccinated, they are getting vaccinated. We have some groups that are a little farther behind, like rural areas, and children who are 12 to 16 years of age have a relatively low vaccination rate. But these vaccine mandates, you know, we've had them before with other vaccines, and they're just another tool in the toolbox that we know increase vaccination rates.
All right. And I wonder also about the number of people that we saw in this most recent surge get COVID. How far does that go in helping to provide natural immunity protection and to keep rates down?
So getting COVID gives you some immunity. We know that you get more consistent and more longer lasting, better immunity from getting vaccination. But getting COVID is equivalent to, say, one dose in a two-dose series. That's a rough approximation. So people getting COVID does help increase the population immunity, and it does help prevent the more serious diseases with COVID, because then if they do get reinfected, it's less likely that they're going to have more serious disease resulting in hospitalization or ICU admission.
Yeah, I wasn't advocating getting sick in lieu of a vaccine, because obviously it's far better to not get COVID. I was just curious, though, how far, because it seems like when we had the really big surge, was it last spring, that then we saw a fairly precipitous drop in cases afterwards. And I was wondering how much of that was attributable to so many people having gotten COVID.
Yeah, I think it was. I think the larger the number of highly susceptible people that you have, then the more infections they're going to have, the higher the risk of surge. And I think we probably had enough population immunity that we were seeing very low case rates until Delta hit. And then that just changed the whole equation. With Delta being so much more infectious, then even a smaller percentage of the population being susceptible resulted in a larger surge in the number of cases.
Dave in Venice emailed us at atcomments@kpcc.org. Please include your location and first name. Said, I got Pfizer 2 doses and the second one caused major reactions. But my siblings who got AstraZeneca in another country had no reactions at all. What explains that disparity?
Oh, I wish I knew. I mean, it's a biological phenomenon, and so it's really difficult to know one's past exposure, the unique immune systems that we all have, the specific times that we get immunized, what else is going on with our immune systems. So it's really just so variable from person to person, and even for one person that, you know, I've heard reports of people having a reaction, more of a reaction to the first dose and less to the second dose, which, doesn't apply across the population, but it's really unpredictable.
Well, and I wonder if one of the reasons why that first dose reaction was stronger could be if the person had had COVID before, maybe not even known, was asymptomatic, but that could have provoked the stronger first dose response.
Yeah, that's really plausible, because we know that people who have had COVID before, they do have more adverse effects following vaccination compared to people who haven't. So that's certainly possible. And we know that many of the infections, up to 40% of the infections, are asymptomatic.
But to Dave's question, even within my family, and I'm sure many of our listeners have this experience, even with like to like, getting the same vaccines at around the same time, the response so different. My mother, with just almost no reaction at all to her vaccines. And for me, on my second dose, I definitely felt it the day afterwards. It was fairly confined, but I certainly had a reaction, and my mom just breezed along like nothing. So, even with, this genetic similarity and all, it's just so hard to explain these things.
It's very hard to explain. And so, what I tell people is just be prepared no matter what reaction you had before. If you're getting another dose, be prepared. Make sure that, if there's something important the next day, a test, if you're a student, or some important presentation for work, don't get vaccinated the day before that. And then also make sure that you have some anti-inflammatories on hand for after you get vaccinated. If there is a reaction, if there is an adverse effect, they seem to respond very well to anti-inflammatories.
Laura in Burbank emailed us at atcomments@kpcc.org. I'm a fully vaccinated person who also has natural immunity. Will getting a booster provide an additional layer of protection, not just to me, but to those around me who are not yet vaccinated?
Yeah, for Laura and for others, whether you've had prior infection or fully vaccinated, those antibodies wane over time. We know that following infection, that reinfection is rare within 90 days, but then after that, after about 4 months or so, that there is increased risk of infection. And it's the same with the breakthrough infections after vaccination, that after a period of time, say 6 to 8 months or so, the antibody levels fall enough so that you can get infected, but you still have enough immunity to prevent serious infection. So I think of it as getting infected in the upper respiratory tract, having like a cold or flu, but not involving the lungs when you have prior immunity. So you don't end up with pneumonia, and you're very unlikely to end up in the hospital.
Dr. Blumberg, you probably saw to the north of you up in Shasta County that they're using National Guard medics to assist at some of the hospitals, Mercy Medical up in Shasta, and also Shasta Regional Medical Center up there, because around the Redding area there have been problems with hospitals that have been overrun with COVID-19 patients, and some of these other areas we've seen with more limited medical care and with a high percentage of unvaccinated residents. Your thought on what National Guard personnel can provide?
Yeah, so what we're seeing is the surge in cases is really concentrated in areas that have lower vaccination rates. So in California, that's going to be in the more rural areas that have lower vaccination rates. And so that's going to be throughout the Central Valley, up and down, and a lot of the Eastern California also. So for those hospitals, National Guard are highly trained to respond to emergencies, and they can provide a lot of support if there aren't enough personnel locally, or other personnel can't be brought in.
All right. We have Peter in San Marino who emailed us. I've heard that COVID vaccines could lead to shingles. So let's take that point first, and then I'll finish that. Is there any evidence that shingles can be triggered by any of the vaccines, Doctor?
I haven't heard that, and that's not been seen in the clinical studies, but many things can trigger shingles, all sorts of stress, and certainly for some people, the vaccine dose may result in a more stressful adverse effect. So it wouldn't surprise me if something like that could trigger shingles. if that does happen, that could happen with any kind of trigger. So probably better to get it that way than to get COVID, for example, and to have that trigger shingles.
Shingles, of course, extremely painful. Peter, the second part of his question is, so should you get shingles vaccines after completing both doses of the COVID vaccine?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the shingles vaccine now is highly effective. And, as you mentioned, shingles can be really debilitating and cause many weeks or months of missing school or work. So people for whom the shingles vaccine is recommended, I highly recommend that. You can get it at the same time as COVID vaccination. Shingles vaccine does have significant adverse effects similar to COVID vaccine that can result in a sore arm and some systemic effects like fever and headache. So many people might want to separate those, but you can give it at the same time or any interval.
Yeah, I remember for my second Shingrix, I think I felt that in my arm for about 5 days afterwards, a little bit sore. But I think back to my boyhood when I gave my grandfather shingles. I had chicken pox, and I gave him shingles from that. And it's the only time I remember, he's a physician, only time I remember him not seeing patients in his office for 2 days straight. He was in so much pain. Still feel badly about that, but what did I know as a kid? But
But Larry, I don't think you gave him shingles.
Really?
Because the shingles comes from reactivation. So it comes from when he was a kid, he got chicken pox. And then coincidentally, sometimes people do have that reactivation if they are exposed to somebody else who has chicken pox. I don't think that was your fault.
Okay, well, I don't have to take full blame at least, so I feel better about that. All right, we're at 866-893-KPECC. Christina in Santa Clarita, your question for Dr. Blumberg.
Hi, I am currently 5 months pregnant, and I'm due for a booster next week. And I was just wondering, before I get the shot, has there been any clinical trials with pregnant women and the booster? And I just have a lot of questions about if I should get this booster and what we know about it for pregnant women.
All right. Very good, Christina.
Well, congratulations, Christina. And yeah, I do recommend that you get the booster. Pregnant women are at higher risk for more severe disease, for ICU admission, and for being on a ventilator if they do get COVID. And in addition, getting COVID during pregnancy may induce preterm labor. So it is much safer to be vaccinated during pregnancy. We do have robust experience with safety during pregnancy. More than 180,000 women have been enrolled into the pregnancy registry that's run through the CDC, and there have been no safety signals identified either among the women who've been vaccinated or their offspring. There's very little data with boosters in pregnancy because they're just more recently recommended. But based on our previous experience, there's no theoretical reason to think that the boosters would result in an increased risk of adverse effects.
This is a very concerning email from Katie in Pasadena. Katie, I'm glad you asked this because it's so disturbing to see this advice you received. I have an 18-month-old daughter, and my mom is recommending I expose her to COVID so that she gets future immunity, quote, like the chicken pox. I disagree with this approach, but I'd like advice on how to respond.
Yeah, I disagree with that approach also. The thing is with getting COVID, it's a crapshoot. And so you may end up getting mild infection. Your 18-month-old may get mild infection and recover, but they may not. They can have severe infection. And we've seen children very young in the first week of life getting COVID and being admitted to the ICU, having involvement in their heart and other problems. It's much safer. There's no question that it is so much safer to be vaccinated. It's a much more controlled way of gaining immunity. It results in better immunity and longer lasting immunity versus getting infection. And, that chickenpox issue did come up previously with chickenpox vaccine. What many people don't realize is that prior to giving chickenpox vaccine in the US, over 100 people would die every year from chickenpox, and half of those were previously healthy children. So, that can be very serious also. I wouldn't take a chance with that.
Well, and the other thing is, we're still trying to figure out how long lasting that natural immunity is. This is not like you get it once and you're never going to get it again. So to me, it's just head scratching advice that she would receive that would confer any sort of a benefit. Let's take another question. This comes from, Terry, who emailed us, after my second Pfizer shot, I had a lot of pain in my feet, sharp, short pains in my fingers. So should I get the Moderna instead of Pfizer for my booster?
Right now, the FDA is only recommending the booster for those who received the Pfizer vaccine, and the only vaccine that's approved for a booster is the Pfizer vaccine at the present time. The FDA will be discussing boosters for Moderna and Johnson & Johnson in a couple weeks. So we may have recommendations for those. But right now, at the present time, I haven't seen data with that sort of approach. It may be better, but the data that's been released so far is very, very small numbers. And so I wouldn't be comfortable with that right now. I would either get the Pfizer booster if that's recommended for your age group, or if you'd like to wait a couple weeks to see what the FDA says about the boosters with the other vaccines.
Diana in Fullerton wants to know, what is the chemical used on the nasal swab for COVID testing? A friend of mine recently said the chemical is a carcinogen and that putting it in your nose could lead to cancer. Man, this keeps you busy with this stuff.
Yeah, I haven't heard. I'm afraid I haven't heard of that one. I've heard of other things related to the swab, but I'm not aware of any chemical on the swab that is carcinogenic. So I'm not aware that that's a risk factor from being exposed to anything on the swab. The swabs are very commonly used materials that we're all exposed to every day.
All right. Yeah, and I didn't see any Prop 65 warning either about the chemicals at test sites. All right, Dr. Blumberg, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to have you with us and answering our listener questions on Air Talk. And I know it's challenging with a lot of misinformation that's out there in the world, but hopefully by dispelling this, people can get it straight and be all the safer. Thank you for doing a valuable part in that.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you for providing a valuable forum for getting the word out.
Dr. Dean Blumberg is Chief of Pediatric Infectious Diseases at UC Davis Children's Hospital and Professor of Medicine at UCD. Coming up, we'll preview the U.S. Supreme Court term, which got underway this morning. Some really big cases the justices will be hearing. We'll be back in 90 seconds. In case you joined us after the start of the hour, we brought you a live news conference from the director of the Oiled Wildlife Care Network, Michael Zaccardi. And he said the good news at this point, given that large oil leak off Huntington Beach, is that only 4 live oiled birds have been recovered where the spill is and that they are being treated. He said that's much better than we had feared. But of course, you're looking at a much longer-term window than just what they've seen within the first few hours. This apt to go on for weeks, even months. So they're out there looking for any birds, particularly at this point. They are most vulnerable to being coated by oil and having their lives threatened as a result. So we'll also continue our coverage in the 11 o'clock hour. We'll be getting the very latest to you. And then at noon, we'll be bringing you a live news conference involving all the different parties involved in responding to the 120-some thousand gallon leak of oil from that pipeline about 9 miles off Huntington Beach. The U.S. Supreme Court's term began today with some very big cases that the justices will be hearing over the course of the next several months. With me from Bloomberg, legal editor Kimberly Robinson, and from SCOTUS Blog, reporter and former editor of SCOTUS Blog, Amy Howe. So good to have you both with us. I understand that you were both there actually sitting next to each other. That's terrific. Amy, let me start with you. First of all, the format, I understand, is a little bit different with the justices back in person?
That's right. And Kimberly and I, we were sitting next to each other, but we were socially distanced.
Very good.
In the courtroom and wearing masks. Yes. So the justices, when they were in the courtroom up until the pandemic, is what they call a hot bench. The lawyer gets up at the podium, and he or she gets about 2 minutes to make an opening statement, and then it turns into kind of a free-for-all in which any justice can ask questions, interrupt the lawyer, interrupt each other. And the justices realized when they went to the telephone for oral arguments during the pandemic that really wasn't going to work. They would really be interrupting each other and the lawyers all the time. So they switched to a format during the pandemic in which they took turns asking questions, starting with the Chief Justice and going through Justice Clarence Thomas in order of seniority. And now that they're back in the courtroom, they have mostly gone back with the free-for-all, but they added a new twist in which after the lawyer is done with his or her initial designated time at the podium, there is an opportunity for each justice to then ask questions again in order of seniority. Although today they were sort of the bread and butter of the court's docket, cases involving water rights and the Armed Career Criminal Act, so not the kind of high-profile, divisive issues. The justices, it turned out, didn't have a lot of additional questions.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I saw Justice Thomas came out at that, rapid fire right after the opening statements, which he didn't typically do pre-pandemic, right? He only became more vocal with the more sort of time-organized approach that was taken in the distance proceedings.
That's right. I mean, he, at one point, I think, had gone as long as 10 years without asking a question. But he asked, by my count, at least 8 or 9 questions today. And the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg used to be sort of the first justice out of the box with the free-for-all. And I think he might have been, in both cases, the first justice to ask questions today.
Interesting. So now part of this may be that he is very distinctly in a conservative majority on the court. Kimberly, any sort of outward evidence of the new composition of the court in how the initial case played?
Well, as Amy said, these were more of the bread and butter kind of cases that the justices heard today. And so they don't really show kind of any indication of that 6-3 conservative court that you hinted at. But we can take a look at what's on the docket for this year, and that tends to show us, that there are really some conservatives on the court flexing their muscles, taking cases on abortion and gun rights, and really seeing where they can go with this new composition.
Well, let's talk first of all about the Mississippi abortion restriction case in which Roe v. Wade is the backdrop. This is Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization. When are the justices, Kimberly, expected to hear this case?
They will hear that in December, and that's, a case challenging Mississippi's 15-week abortion ban. Of course, abortion has been in the spotlight at the Supreme Court because the justices let that Texas law go into place, which bans abortions at 6 weeks. But they were very clear to say they weren't ruling on the merits, that it was a procedural issue there. In the Dobbs case, though, it's very much going at the heart of Roe versus Wade and abortion rights.
All right. We have another issue involving gun laws. This is New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin, a challenge to a New York state law requiring anyone who carries a handgun in public to demonstrate proper cause to obtain a license. So, Amy, just share with us a little bit about the significance of this case and how far it could reach.
Yeah, I mean, that is kind of the interesting question. The Supreme Court in 2008 and 2010 said in a pair of cases that there is a right under the Second Amendment to have a gun in your home for self-defense. And so this is a case in which they're going to say more about whether the Constitution also protects the right to carry a gun outside of the home. They have been asked to take up this question, or sort of a very similar variation to this question, repeatedly over the last 10 years. And now that perhaps that they have this conservative majority, the conventional wisdom had long been that there were 4 conservative justices on the court who wanted to take up this question. Justice Clarence Thomas had written a couple of dissenting opinions in which he talked about the Second Amendment as sort of the unwanted stepchild at the party, but they weren't sure whether or not they had a 5th justice, perhaps the Chief Justice. They weren't certain about him, whether or not they had a 5th justice to vote for a more expansive view of the Second Amendment. And now with Justice Amy Coney Barrett on the court, perhaps they think that they do. And so, they say, look at the text of the challengers in this case say, look at the text of the Constitution, which refers to the right to keep and bear arms. The right to bear arms has to mean something, is their argument.
So, and Brett Kavanaugh also with a very expansive view of the Second Amendment. So if in fact, in this case, the plaintiffs prevail before the Supreme Court, Kimberly, this could have a big effect on many areas of the country. For example, in California, in urban areas like Los Angeles County, San Francisco, other urban areas, it's extremely difficult for people to get a concealed carry permit. They have to show some, very in the moment sort of threat for them to get approval to do that. If the justices sided with the plaintiffs in this case, would that potentially undo those kinds of restrictions?
It sure does seem like it. So, the California scheme and the New York scheme, there are a little bit different, but at the heart of both of these is really a lot of discretion for local authorities to decide whether or not, individuals can get these different permits. And, I think if the Supreme Court strikes down the New York law, it'll go a long way to kind of giving advice to other states that, there can't be as much discretion, and there really does need to be kind of a way for people to really practically be able to get these kinds of concealed carry permits.
We're talking with Kimberly Robinson of Bloomberg. Amy Howe of SCOTUS Blog will continue as we preview this new term of the U.S. Supreme Court, which began this morning, and they're back in person. It's Air Talk on KPCC. Earlier today, the U.S. Supreme Court rejected a long-shot bid from voters in the District of Columbia. They sought the ability to elect representatives to Congress. The group of voters said their inability to vote for a congressional representative violated the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution and due process. And they used as a comparison how voters overseas are able to vote in congressional elections, but not those who live in the District of Columbia. Lower court had ruled against the voters, holding that they don't live in a state, and the Supreme Court rejected the bid of the voters to overturn that. The Supreme Court also declined to consider whether states can require ID cards or driver's licenses to identify people as convicted sex offenders. There also is what is called the shadow docket, in which the court, without doing an actual formal hearing of oral arguments and taking on cases as it typically does, months after they've agreed to hear a case, issues a decision which has immediate impact on whether a law goes into effect or a presidential executive order stays in power. Amy, can you tell us a little bit about what the shadow docket is, and has it become more commonly used?
So the answer to your second question is yes, has become more commonly used in terms of when you have people coming to the Supreme Court or governments coming to the Supreme Court and asking the Supreme Court to step in on an emergency basis, on a temporary basis, and put a lower court ruling on hold, or as abortion providers did in the case of the Texas abortion law, to block the enforcement of SB 8, the Texas law that bars abortions after the 6th week of pregnancy, while their appeals are pending. And I think it was really Texas fb0f5cadd7794893bb45adb70142c74e and the Supreme Court's order blocking the Centers for Disease Control from enforcing its moratorium on federal evictions that really got people paying attention to the shadow docket. It's something that lawyers and law professors and certainly reporters, because we've been writing about it, have been focusing on for a while. A law professor at the University of Texas Law School, Stephen Bladdock, has been sort of detailing the use of the shadow docket. And it was really the Trump administration, when it had lower courts putting its initiatives like the travel ban and some of its immigration policies on hold, would come to the Supreme Court asking it for permission to go ahead while its appeals were pending in the lower courts. And the Trump administration came to the Supreme Court, more in 4 years than the Bush administration and the Obama administration in 16 years did. On the other hand, the Trump administration, when it went to the Supreme Court, was overwhelmingly successful. And I think in part because the Trump administration was successful when it went to the Supreme Court asking for emergency relief, that led other people and groups to think, perhaps this is something we should be doing. We can, it may be a long shot, but it's certainly worth a try. And so the justices have been making a lot of decisions on the shadow docket lately. And so, some of the criticism is the criticism of the substance of the decision being made on the shadow docket, and then there is criticism of the process. It's unlike the decisions that the Supreme Court makes in a case like the Dobbs, the Mississippi abortion case, where there's a lot of briefing that's going to come in. They're going to hear oral arguments in open court, and then several months later, they'll issue a decision that explains the reasons for what they're doing. It all happens much faster and in the shadows, so to speak.
Yeah, and I wonder about sort of the differences in the appeals. Well, I mean, like the CDC moratorium on eviction, that isn't something that came through a legislature, say, like Texas's abortion restrictions, for example. Does the court treat it differently if it's something that comes from the executive branch than if it comes through a legislature?
Well, that does affect, sort of certainly the standards that the lower courts use. I mean, one thing with the shadow docket is meant to be temporary in some cases. You're asking them to block something or put something on hold while the litigation proceeds. But certainly the effects of the Supreme Court's ruling, even when it's in theory temporary, and this is, I think, a lot of people's sort of complaint about it, can have long-term effects. And so, for example, in the Texas abortion case, the Supreme Court said, we have serious questions about whether or not this law is constitutional. And the justices in the majority would say, we're not ruling on the constitutionality. At the same time, the fact remains that you cannot get, an abortion in Texas right now.
All right. Kimberly, let's talk about some of the church-state issues that the court is going to be taking on. There a particular one that stands out to you with potentially far-reaching effects on separation between church and state?
Well, there is a case that the justices are going to hear sometime this term, which involves whether or not states can eliminate from their student aid programs religious schools. And this is an area where the justices have kind of been dancing around for the past several terms, and they'll kind of meet it square on this term. And then just recently we saw the justices grant a case in which a Christian organization wanted to fly its flag in front of the Boston City Hall, and they were denied, even though other private groups have been allowed to. And so that's another case that the justices just added to their docket. They've been really protecting strongly religious rights. We saw that this summer and last summer with COVID requests that came to the justices. They largely gave states and localities a lot of leeway to deal with COVID restrictions, except when it came to restrictions that impinged on religious practice. And we saw kind of consistently across the board, the justices were turning those down as the pandemic continued on and on.
All right. I want to thank both of you for being with us and previewing the U.S. Supreme Court term, which got underway today. Thank you so much. That's Kimberly Robinson, legal editor at Bloomberg, and Amy Howe, reporter, former editor at SCOTUS blog. And both of them were right there as the U.S. Supreme Court opened up in person today. First time they've done that in many, many months, as the last term was done virtually, with the sessions done with a bit of a different format, back to what they had been doing pre-pandemic with the action today in D.C. Coming up on Air Talk, we'll have the very latest on the 120,000-plus gallon oil leak off the coast of Orange County. We'll talk about the effects and what are the thoughts about the potential cause of the leak. We'll tell you about that momentarily. Good morning, it's Air Talk. I'm Larry Mantle. Later this hour, we'll take a look at Instagram and concerns about the anxieties and depression that it may give rise to in girls and young women. But we begin with the anxiety that is the result of that oil leak. We just heard from NPR Hourly News, and we've been following it. We had the news conference at the start of the last hour, finding out about the shorebirds that have been injured by the oil to this point. And coming up in about an hour, we'll have a news conference for you live with the various agencies that are involved in responding to the leak of approximately 126,000 gallons of oil off the coast of Huntington Beach, Newport Beach, and Laguna Beach. With us is Orange County Supervisor Katrina Foley. Her district encompasses Huntington Beach and Newport Beach. Thank you very much, Supervisor Foley. First of all, at this point, how are the efforts going to contain the oil from the sensitive habitat areas like Bolsa Chica and some of the other wildlife reserves?
Well, thank you for having me. We are working around the clock here in Orange County, both with our county public services as well as our city marine safety divisions, our fire departments, our Orange County Sheriff's Department, Harbor Patrol, the Coast Guard, and we, of course, expect the responsible party to make sure that they provide the resources, the equipment needed, the booms, the barriers to be able to get this cleaned up and to stop it from moving further into our wetlands, especially.
You have a number of your constituents who have told reporters that Friday night they smelled the smell of the oil and realized something was wrong, but the spill was not reported until Saturday morning, apparently from workers on the oil platform miles offshore of Huntington Beach. Do you have any additional information about why there was such a lag time?
Well, I can't comment on the smell because our office actually had been receiving reports about a different kind of smell that we were working on in the Newport Canal. There was a blockage of the water, and therefore fish were dying in the canal, and so we were working with the state to be able to dredge that area. So that's the smell that we were dealing with. I learned about the impact of the oil spill at 1:38 p.m. on Saturday. I got a text message from a local official to give me the heads up that this was happening. Then I immediately contacted our Orange County Sheriff to find out what was going on. So he connected me through to our Harbor Patrol. And I know that our Harbor Patrol took the Coast Guard out very early in the morning, first thing at sunrise on Saturday morning, to be able to go visit the platform and to look for spillage. And that's where we started to learn about the extent of the damage. So I want to credit our Harbor Patrol for really taking the lead in making sure that the appropriate people were informed to be able to get resources moving and to get the valve turned off at the platform and to the pipeline. And
do we know that valve has now been turned off?
Yes, the valve has been turned off, and according to Amplify Energy, they've turned off the valve and they've capped the pipe, and there should be no more spillage from the pipeline. According to what they told us yesterday, and of course we're waiting for all of this to be investigated, but according to what they told us yesterday, there was only 126,000 gallons that could be in the pipeline. And so if that's true, then we shouldn't be seeing any further spillage. I was able to travel with the Coast Guard aerial yesterday with State Senator Tom Umberg and Assembly Member Patrick O'Donnell, who represents Long Beach. Tom Umberg also represents Huntington Beach. And we traveled over into that area around the platform, and you really didn't see that much of the oil spillage near the platform. So it does seem like it's all moved away from the pipeline and is traveling south and kind of heading up towards our shores here along our Orange County coast. But,
so,
I'm not an expert. I'm just going.
Yeah, no, that's good to hear what you saw, though. Supervisor Foley, thank you very much for being with us. We appreciate it.
Yes. Thank you.
Katrina Foley, Orange County Supervisor, joining us. KPECC senior reporter Jill Replogle with us as well. Jill, what have we learned about the operator of the platform and the pipeline which runs between the Port of Long Beach and the offshore platform in federal waters?
Well, we haven't had any updates this morning on that. We do know that the owner has owned it for some time. Yesterday, he was at a press conference and said that they had done all the routine safety checks. They had just done a check recently. They still, at that time, yesterday afternoon, did not have information on what could be the cause of the spill.
All right. And we're expecting, again, a news conference at around noon in which we should have additional details on efforts to deal with it. Jill, at this point, Crystal Cove, I know that state park and state beach is in the line of the oil. I don't know that it's actually hit Crystal Cove yet, but do you know what kinds of efforts they're doing to try and contain the spill before it comes ashore in that farther south area?
They have not talked extensively about that yet. Supervisor Foley did, say that she hoped that they would be getting some skimmers to get what they saw with their overhead flight, some sort of trails of oil heading in that direction. As of yet, I know that oil has washed up on the shores of Laguna Beach. I don't know if it has been detected onshore south of that.
All right. Jill, thank you very much. We appreciate it. Brad Avery is the mayor of Newport Beach. Mayor, thank you for being with us. Last I heard, all of your beaches in the city are closed. Is that correct?
Well, Larry, they're closed from the high tide line to the water, so from the dry sand to the water, basically.
Okay. And what's going on there right now to prepare for the oil's potential coming ashore?
Well, our lifeguards, all of our public safety folks are obviously very well of this. The city's been having regular meetings. The EOC, Emergency Operations Center, had a meeting. So we're just monitoring the situation. There has not been much oil at all that's come ashore in Newport since the initial spill, where we had some go on shore in West Newport above 56th Street. But we haven't had the same impacts, for instance, as Bolsa Chica and Huntington Beach.
Okay. Well, that's good to hear. And do you know what the prognosis is for Crystal Cove?
We don't. We've been very fortunate, Larry, with the weather. It's been very flat, very little wind, and this is really, I think, a big part of the reason that we're just not, we don't have more impacts. I have not heard of any oil going ashore of Crystal Cove. There's bits and pieces here and there, I think, but nothing major. We've had a few, blobs, if you will, found in the harbor entrance. But we have booms in the harbor entrance right now, and between the Orange County Sheriff's Harbor Patrol and our own Harbor Patrol, we're prepared to, close the entrance as needed. But right now, the entrance still remains open to vessel traffic, although we're urging people to, not traverse the harbor entrance unless you absolutely have to.
I know we're only a couple days into this, but what sort of economic effect does this have on your city?
Well, I think it's significant for all the cities, even those that aren't affected yet. Just the news of an oil spill keeps people away, and rightly so. Obviously, we have a robust sport fishing businesses, very successful whale watching operations. Tourism for all of it, coastal cities, tourism is a huge part of the revenue, and so there are significant impacts. And I'm sure all the cities will be looking for some help from state and federal government on that.
Mayor Avery, what about odor from the leak? Are you getting much petroleum smell from it?
Well, initially we did, and we had reports from residents, far inland as Newport Heights, maybe a mile and a half away. But I talked with our harbor master today and last night, and they weren't detecting anything. But I think we get these random reports of people smelling things, and that makes sense, But there's been at least lately, no significant odor.
All right. Mayor Avery, anything else to add that our listeners should know about what's happening there in Newport Beach from this leak?
Well, there's a lot of things we can't control, Larry. The spill's going to do what it does, and then we just have to respond when we're threatened. And to that regard, it's been a robust response from all the agencies, a lot of collaboration. Yesterday, there were 10 response vessels working, sweeping the biggest deposits of oil. And that work is continuing. I'm not sure how many vessels are on site right now, but we've had a lot of residents report seeing the vessels working. With 2 vessels focused on our harbor entrance yesterday morning, I think, and evening. But then they moved on as they found more significant areas to go to. So all in all, I think it's been going pretty well, and I can only speak for Newport Beach.
All right.
Huntington Beach and Bolsa-Chica has been impacted. You hear things up and down the coast about oil ashore, but it's hard to tell what's going on in other areas. But our lifeguards are patrolling the beach pretty constantly to monitor the situation. But it remains offshore, and the current is going in a southerly direction toward Dana Point. And unfortunately, the weather for the next couple of days is going to remain calm, so that gives the recovery effort of getting oil off the water. That really helps them. And of course, we've got evaporation going on as well for the lighter oil that's on the water.
All right. I want to thank you, Mayor Avery. I know you have to go because we've got the Joint Incident Command news conference coming up at about noon. You're going to be there for that in Huntington Beach?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so we'll be hearing you again on our air coming up in less than an hour. Thank you, Mayor Avery. We appreciate your being with us.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Brad Avery is the mayor of Newport Beach. Again, we'll have that news conference for you live coming up in the noon hour right here on KPCC. Back to Jill Replogle, KPCC, and LA's senior reporter. Jill, we heard from Michael Zaccardi of the Oiled Wildlife Care Network, his news conference, which was around 10 o'clock. And he said, fortunately, they had 4 oiled birds that they were treating at this point. It was not as bad as they had expected, but of course, this could go on for weeks and even months where they see additional, shorebirds and marine mammals that might be injured by the oil. Just anything to add on what you've seen in terms of the effort to try and treat the animals?
Right. Well, one thing is that there have been apparently quite a few reports of people seeing birds with oiled feet, some oil on their feet, and but able to fly away when rescue workers got towards them. And so that will be something, to watch, whether that ends up affecting those birds in the future. So there's some concern around that. One thing that I think is interesting is there aren't as many birds in the area as is normal, at least in terms of sort of the data that they were able to get from kind of birding areas and birders. And this is speculation, but one thing that Supervisor Foley and a few other people mentioned is that because of the air show, which is very loud and can be very disturbing to birds, that perhaps there just weren't as many birds around at the time, which is somewhat of a silver lining. If there weren't as many birds in the area, there are not as many birds that could be, that could be subjected to the oil spill.
Yeah, it was quite Saturday, I saw the air show from Long Beach. It's visible down the coast, and an extraordinary show. And then once they found out this huge oil leak took place, they canceled yesterday's day. That, of course, a huge draw. People come from throughout the region for the Pacific Air Show at Huntington Beach. Jill, thanks very much. We'll look forward to your coverage of this throughout the day.
All right. Thanks, Larry.
Senior reporter for LAist and KPCC, Jill Replogle. Joining us now, our John Horn, who covers entertainment. We have a vote in from the members of IATSE, the huge union that represents crew members in Hollywood. This is a strike authorization vote. John, what are the results?
You would call it a landslide. More than 98% voted to authorize a strike. IATSE said about 90% of all eligible members voted. The head of IATSE said the members have spoken loud and clear. This vote is about the quality of life as well as the health and safety of those who work in the film and TV industry. So what happens next is this gives IATSE a lot more bargaining power with the bargaining agents for the studios and the networks, the AMPTP, which is the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers. They have said, as often is said in negotiations, their last offer is their last offer. So now we're at a crossroads. If the AMPTP doesn't come back to the bargaining table, or it does and IATSE doesn't like the offer, it's very likely we could have a shutdown in the next couple of weeks, and that would basically stop all television production outside some certain networks like HBO that are not part of this collective bargaining agreement.
I'm almost more impressed with the voting turnout, John, than by the 98% approval of authorization. For any union to have 90% of its members vote, that's extraordinary.
Yeah, and I think it really gets to the heart of the issue. And the heart of the issue is that the people who are in the IATSE, and these are people who, make sets for movies, they do costumes, makeup, they do editing, cinematography. I mean, basically, without them, you can have all the actors and directors in the world and screenwriters, but you can't make anything without these crews. And I think they felt during the pandemic that they really kind of bit the bullet, worked hard. Maybe they didn't work as much as they needed to. And they come out of the pandemic and they say, listen, everybody's doing pretty well. I mean, Netflix is making billions of dollars, and yet we're still working for minimum wage in many cases. And also, we don't have very good working conditions. We've been talking to people like production coordinators and editors, and they say that they are working very long days, maybe 70-hour weeks, often without overtime, and they think that they deserve better working conditions than the people above them, actors, directors, and producers.
The AMPTP, which represents the producers, these large entertainment companies with whom IATSE negotiators are at odds. The AMPTP statement says, we remain committed to reaching an agreement that will keep the industry working. We deeply value our IATSE crew members and are committed to working with them to avoid shutting down the industry at such a pivotal time, particularly since the industry is still recovering from the economic fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic. A deal can be made at the bargaining table, but it will require both parties working together in good faith with a willingness to compromise and to explore new solutions to resolve the open issues. That, again, from the producers, the AMPTP. So, John, do you think they get back to the bargaining table quickly here?
Well, I mean, they could get back to it, but if the AMPTP or IATSE aren't budging, then we're at a crossroads. And the contract has expired. I mean, we're working in Hollywood. Their members are working in Hollywood now without a contract. So, it's not as if the contract's going to come up in November and then people could walk. There's no contract currently. It's just been extended. So yes, if both sides end up back at the bargaining table and some give and some don't, and there's a little, nobody ever is supposed to get all they want in a negotiation. Everybody should be a little bit unhappy because that means there's been a real deal. There's been some give and some take. So the question now is, from IATSE's position, they don't like the AMPTP offer. So as they're saying, again, more than 98% of 90% of their members voted to authorize a strike. They're not going to change their position. I think they really want the AMPTP to come back, give them better, wages, better overtime rules, better safety precautions. I mean, we talked last week about turnaround time. You can work till 10 at night as an editor and have to be back at the job like at 6 the next morning. I think a lot of people feel those protections are long overdue, and the pandemic really kind of magnified worker safety issues. And I think these people who may work below the line also feel that, they deserve a cut of the pie. They've been working very hard, very long hours for not a lot of money. The industry is suffering and has suffered, but it's not as if a lot of people who are making content aren't doing very well.
John, thank you for the update on the strike authorization vote, overwhelmingly approved and authorized by IATSE, which represents tens of thousands of crew members in Hollywood TV and film production, 60,000 some U.S. members of IATSE involved. It's Air Talk on KPCC. Coming up, we'll take a look at what social media platforms Facebook and Instagram are dealing with concerns about particularly how girls and young women are affected by the platforms. We'll be back in 1 minute. Facebook and its Instagram and WhatsApp platforms are down across wide swaths of the world today. Facebook's internal systems used by employees also went down. The company said it's aware some people are having trouble accessing the Facebook app, and it's working on restoring access. Regarding the internal failures, Adam Mosseri, the head of Instagram, tweeted, "It feels like a snow day." The company doesn't say what could be the cause for the outage, which began around 8:45 this morning Pacific time. It's normal for websites and apps to suffer outages, though one on a global scale is rare. Users have reported being unable to access Facebook in California, New York, and Europe. Stay tuned throughout the day here on KPCC. We'll bring you updates on what the potential cause is and how long those platforms might be down. But speaking of Facebook and Instagram, the Wall Street Journal recently broke a story revealing internal documents from Facebook showing the company is aware that its photocentric social media platform Instagram negatively impacts the mental health of some teen girls. According to the internal report, Facebook has been conducting research into how Instagram affects young users, while at the same time it had been planning to release a version of Instagram for those under the age of 13. Those plans have been put on pause because of backlash to the Wall Street Journal report. The report also sparked a subcommittee hearing last week on Capitol Hill, with company leaders telling lawmakers that the Wall Street Journal story mischaracterized the research. A second hearing is scheduled for tomorrow with the whistleblower who shared the internal documents. She was on 60 Minutes last night. We talk with Wall Street Journal reporter Georgia Wells, who joins us to talk about the research. But first, at the hearing last week at that Senate subcommittee, Facebook's global head of safety, Antigone Davis, addressed the recent reporting about Facebook's internal research in her opening remarks.
The research showed that many teens say that Instagram is helping them with hard issues that are so common to being a teen. In fact, one of the main slides referenced in the article includes a survey of 12 difficult and serious issues like loneliness, anxiety, sadness, and eating disorders. We asked teens who told us that they were struggling with these issues whether Instagram was making things better, worse, or having no effect. On 11 of the 12 issues, teen girls who said they struggled with those issues were more likely to say that Instagram was affirmatively helping them, not making it worse. That was true for teen boys on 12 of 12 issues.
Georgia Wells, Wall Street Journal reporter who covers tech from San Francisco and broke the story regarding Facebook from its internal documents. Georgia, thank you very much for being with us. First, your response to Facebook's critique of your and your colleagues' reporting for the Journal, saying that it was only a slice and not the complete picture.
Hey, thank you for having me. Yeah, so the article makes clear that it's a minority of teens, in particular teen girls, who kind of discuss these kind of negative impacts with researchers. The article does not dispute that for the majority of teens, the Instagram can be manageable and the positives can outweigh the negatives. Like I kind of feel like we're talking cross purposes with Instagram at this point, because the article, what it made clear was for this minority of users, there's this research that Facebook has conducted internally that kind of called out these potentially harmful consequences. And her statement, I don't think, contradicts that.
George, I was also wondering if you were to survey teen girls about body image and depression, a wide range of things that many teens struggle with over the course of these challenging years, that sort of any platform that exposes them to content might be seen as a potential source of anxiety. YouTube videos, for example, with people that are influencers and look a certain way and tout looking a certain way. Even back when young people watch television, there could be idealized human, body images that could create, difficulties for girls and young women seeing that. From these internal documents, how much of you do you think this should be laid at the feet of Instagram specifically?
So much of this harm comes from something called negative social comparison, where people, when they're scrolling through this content, they approach it from more of like a how do I stack up to this person versus like I'm just trying to learn more about them. And, negative social comparison goes back well beyond Instagram. But what Instagram's own researchers call out in these documents is that negative social comparison is more severe on Instagram than on some of their competitors, such as TikTok or Snapchat. And the reason they give is that on TikTok, content tends to be more performative, so it's kind of divorced from perceptions of real life, while on Snapchat, content tends to be like there's often people use these silly face filters. So it's like, transforming your face into that of a puppy. And so that kind of focus on the face and this silliness tends to kind of buffer this experience of kind of viewing content from and interpreting it as someone's best life. While on Instagram, content tends to be, the highlights of someone's life, and the focus tends to be on the body and on lifestyle. And this is what Instagram's own researchers call that.
Georgia Wells of the Wall Street Journal, tech reporter based in San Francisco. She joined us recently for that piece about the bots that the Journal did, great investigative piece, bots used on TikTok to get a sense of how people, the content that people were being sent to. Also with us is a frequent Air Talk guest from San Diego State University, psychology professor Jean Twenge. Her book, iGen, Why Today's Super-Connected Kids Are Growing Up Less Rebellious, More Tolerant, Less Happy, and Completely Unprepared for Adulthood. Professor, always a pleasure to have you with us. Your thoughts about these internal documents from Facebook regarding the effect of Instagram on girls and young women?
Well, I got a chance because the Wall Street Journal posted the full text of all of those documents, 209 pages, and they make fascinating reading. They very clearly show that Facebook is well aware of the negative effects of Instagram on many teen girls. They are aware that those negative effects, especially around body image and social comparison around appearance, that they're much stronger for younger users as opposed to older ones. They go very in depth about the emotions that girls are experiencing. And one of the documents, it talks about them going through a grief spiral in terms of their depression and comparing themselves and their bodies. And I think it's really stunning just how much research they did, and yet they didn't really make any changes to the platform in response.
What are some changes you think they could make that would do away or at least mitigate some of the deleterious effects?
Well, because their own research shows these effects seem to be more negative for younger users, and other research has shown that as well. Enforce the age limit. So right now there's an age minimum of 13, yet it's not enforced. It's very common for kids 12 and under to sign up to Instagram and other social media platforms because there's no age verification. So that would be a first step. However, 13 is an odd time to start accessibility for social media. It's right at puberty. It's right when bullying peaks. So it might be better to raise that age limit to 16 or even 18. In that way, you'll be able to better protect the population that seems to have the most negative impacts, according to Facebook's own research.
And do we have a sense of how heavy use of Instagram is among teen girls, Professor Twangy? Is it pretty much universal or close to universal usage?
Well, social media use in general is close to universal among teen girls. From a national survey from a few years ago, 90% of 17 and 18-year-old girls use social media at least once a day. And those measures, by the way, really don't capture just how much they're on the apps, that it's pretty common for teens to spend 2 or 3 hours a day, if not in some cases 5 or 6 hours a day on social media. So it's a big influence on their lives.
And Professor, is there anything that parents can do if they have daughters who are regular social media users and to sort of help ground them in understanding what they're seeing, what they're experiencing isn't an accurate depiction of the broader world?
Well, the tough part is that just telling people that doesn't work. There's solid research on this. Even with adult women, if you say, you know what, these are not representative images, that isn't effective. It still tends to hit people at an emotional core that's hard to get around with any kind of disclaimer. So I think we really have to go farther to protect kids. So I have 3 kids myself. They happen to be all girls, so I've thought about this a lot. I think the best thing is to make that rule of definitely no social media until you're 13, given that's the law. And even beyond that, maybe it's better to wait to 16. Now, if that ship's already sailed, what you do is put limits, reasonable limits. Say, okay, you really want to be on social media, well, choose one platform, probably not Instagram, maybe Snapchat or TikTok, and you can be on it for an hour a day, and that's it. Use it well, and you can enforce that with the parental controls that are on most smartphones.
All right. We're talking with psychology professor Jean Twangy of San Diego State University. The professor is author of iGen, Why Today's Superconnected Kids Are Growing Up Less Rebellious, More Tolerant, Less Happy, and Completely Unprepared for Adulthood. Georgia Wells, tomorrow we're going to have the Facebook whistleblower testify on Capitol Hill. What potentially is on the table for Facebook and its Instagram platform to change in the wake of Congress being concerned about this and all the media reporting on the documents you obtained?
We're at an interesting moment because we're seeing really bipartisan support in Congress and among lawmakers for action. And it's kind of unusual, the extent to how bipartisan this kind of support for action is. So But now we're interested in trying to figure out like what might action look like if lawmakers decide, you know what, we need more regulation, we need more control, especially for younger users. And so tomorrow when I'm watching, I'll be hearing I'll be trying to listen for like, are there any kind of concrete details, anything lawmakers suggest that they might be looking at in terms of kind of how to lessen some of these effects on teens or kind of protect teens in this space.
You know, George, as I think we've talked before about this issue, the real challenge is, of course, you know, for a social media platform, its reason for being is to attract as many engaged users as possible. That is the business model of it. And so whether it's algorithms that it uses or images that are going to, you know, get people to focus on it in a feed or to click on it, whatever the process is, you know, that is their job to do it. And so I guess I wonder at root, aside from changing an age limit like Professor Twangy was talking about, how do you provide content in a different way that doesn't maximize usage?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Like one of the aspects of Instagram but it's certainly an aspect that's relevant to other social media platforms that the researchers called out at times was this algorithmic recommendation of content. And so what we're seeing here is one of the teens was telling me how she went on Instagram to search for kind of videos around how to exercise a little bit more. So she searches for these videos, and then when she logs back onto Instagram kind of in the coming days, then her explore feed, the search bar, it becomes filled with video after video about weight loss and dieting and exercising and perfect body and eat this, not that. And so that's one of the aspects that can be particularly harmful for these teens, that, you know, they search a couple of times for something and then the algorithm continues to feed them content about this. So, you know, maybe that's one area. Another area is their contact with people beyond close friends. So here we're seeing a lot of content from influencers. And kind of some of the teens described this feeling of like going through all their friends' content on Instagram and then bumping into Instagram to an influencer piece of content. And this is an influencer whose entire career is like projecting this life with the perfect body and the perfect life, and how it suddenly felt more attainable to them because it was like sandwiched in with their friends' content. But like this kind of feeling these teens were describing was one of like, oh my goodness, like I'm not worthy.
Yeah.
So I don't know what fixes to this look like, but these were some of the areas that the teens were calling out to me.
Yeah, and you can sure understand the anxiety that provokes. Thank you so much, Georgia. Appreciate it, and all the great work you and your colleagues on the investigative tech team at the Wall Street Journal are doing. That's Georgia Wells of the Wall Street Journal. Jean Twangy is professor of psychology at San Diego State University and author of iGen. Frank in Cathedral City said, I have over 60,000 followers on TikTok for a nutrition and exercise program I do, and I specifically shy away from Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube because TikTok seems more focused on a humane outlook. People who make critical or nasty statements are actually confronted by other TikTok users, where I find those kinds of comments are allowed to fester without pushback on many of the other platforms. Thanks so much for that. We'll be back with more On Air Talk in just 90 seconds. Speaking of Nick Roman, he of the Triple Play, he'll be joining me with A. Martinez later this week. We'll preview the Dodgers' start of their playoff quest for another World Championship Wednesday. 5:10 first pitch at Dodger Stadium, a one-game single elimination playoff for the wild card against the St. Louis Cardinals at Dodger Stadium. We'll preview that for you, and should the Dodgers be victorious, They would then, on Friday, go to San Francisco to take on the Giants in a divisional playoff series. But we don't want to get ahead of ourselves. Wednesday, late afternoon, is the start of the Dodgers' playoff quest. Well, on Friday, Governor Newsom announced both public and private school students 12 and older will have to be fully vaccinated against COVID-19 to continue in-person learning. It's not an immediate mandate. This would happen after the federal government provides final approval for vaccines for specific age groups. Already, LA Unified has created such a mandate by the time the next semester starts in January. It's what Governor Newsom had to say at this announcement Friday at a San Francisco school.
We want to end this pandemic. We are all exhausted by it. And the purpose of this is to continue to lead in that space. I believe we will be the first state in America to move forward with this mandate and requirement, but I do not believe by any stretch of the imagination we'll be the last state.
With us from UC Hastings School of Law, Professor Dorit Rice. Her policy areas include vaccine law and is a member of the Vaccine Working Group on Ethics and Policy, an independent nonprofit project. Professor Rice, thank you very much for being with us today. One of the things that was notable to me is that in the governor's order on Friday, there is an exemption here for personal belief, and I believe it would take the legislature to remove that exception. Is that true?
That's exactly right. The governor is using the power of the Department of Public Health to add vaccines to the required vaccine for schools, but the law requires that if the Department of Public Health adds vaccine, it provides a personal belief exemption. To change that, you'd need legislative action.
And if the personal belief exemption was removed, could the state go so far through the legislature as only allowing an exception for medical reasons for someone for whom it would be dangerous to be vaccinated?
Yes, that is what the state did in 2015 when it removed the non-medical exemption, and that has been challenged in court, and multiple courts have found that that is constitutional. So the state could choose to not offer a non-medical exemption at all.
Okay. And is there any other avenue for people to legally challenge a mandate like this?
People could go to the court as they did it with the 2015 legal change. There's not a lot that changed since 2015. The one thing that may be raised is the Supreme Court has in the past few years, in the past year and a half, tightened the protection of religious freedom, but it's not clear that the Supreme Court will go as far as saying you have to give a religious exemption from a school vaccine mandate. That will require changing long-standing law, and it's more than the court has indicated it will do so far.
All right. You were on with us, as I recall, when we talked about the college and university mandate that was put into effect, and there's been nothing there that slowed those down, have they?
No. So there's been a lot of litigation around the university mandate, and some of it is still ongoing. There has been one court in Michigan, a federal district court, that has ordered a temporary restraining order and a temporary ban on a vaccine mandate applied to athletes on the grounds that the university should have given them a religious exemption. But that's one low-level court in a decision that I think is problematic. Most of the cases upheld university mandates.
Also with us is Howard Bloom, education reporter for the Los Angeles Times. Howard, I appreciate your being with us. As I mentioned at the outset, LA Unified had already implemented this and is planning to do so for the start of the spring semester. Have there been groups of parents, to your knowledge, that have challenged the LA mandate?
There has not been a lawsuit filed over the mandate, but I think we can expect one imminently. They've already sent, in essence, there's already been a demand letter sent where it says, you have to cease and desist or else we will take further action. And that's generally a precursor to a lawsuit. Given that the district has already been sued for making students wear masks, and they've also been sued for making students take a weekly coronavirus test, I think it's pretty safe to assume they're going to be sued for requiring vaccines.
Yeah. And I wonder, this isn't necessarily in the heart of your beat, but for many of the rural school districts in California where you've got high percentages of people choosing not to get vaccinated, I wonder what this does potentially to average daily attendance if the kids don't end up showing up, or are they going to have an independent study alternative where those districts would still get funding for those students? You have any sense how that would work?
I think the first thing to see is this whole issue of the personal belief exemption, because, and even if you think about it, a personal belief exemption is even more loose than a religious exemption. I don't think and this is actually a question for your other expert, but I don't think they're to be considered identical, because any opposition to a vaccine would be based on a personal belief, would it not, right? Whether you're religious or not. And if there's a personal belief exemption, it seems that a lot of people would go that route before pulling their child from a school. But theoretically, if they were to do so, then they would have the option of the state's version of homeschooling. They could enroll a student in independent study. They could enroll a student in an online-only school, for example. Those would be the options. But the other thing to track, of course, would be to see if the legislature is going to eliminate the personal belief exemption, because otherwise that's just a huge loophole that would seem to stand in the way of the state going forward with this policy.
Yeah, Professor Rice, can you elaborate? Does a personal exemption give almost unlimited latitude for someone to claim it?
Yes, a personal belief exemption can be claimed for pretty much everything, whereas the religious exemption has to meet somewhat more stringent criteria, though even there it's really hard to police religious exemption. But personal belief is wide open.
All right, we'll continue our conversation with UC Hastings School of Law professor Dorit Rice and Howard Bloom, education reporter for the Los Angeles Times. I'd like to hear from you what you think about the state of California implementing this requirement that public and private school students, in returning to their campus classrooms, must be fully vaccinated for COVID-19 once the vaccines have received full FDA approval within the given age range of the students to whom this would apply. 866-893-KPCC, or you can email us at atcomments@kpcc.org. Please include your location and your first name. Back in 1 minute. In a few minutes, we're expecting a news conference in Huntington Beach where the agencies that are responding to that 126,000-gallon oil leak will be talking about what their efforts entail. You'll be hearing from civic and county officials. That event being held in Huntington Beach right around noon. We'll have that news conference for you live right here on KPCC, and then we will be joining in progress Fresh Air with Terry Gross. So looking forward to our interview with Eddie Muller, who is the authority on film noir. He joins us from time to time on Air Talk to talk some of his favorite movies, and I know it'll be a great conversation when we get to that after the news conference coming up on Fresh Air. Right now, we're talking about Governor Newsom's announcement Friday that all California students will be expected, once full FDA approval is granted to the COVID-19 vaccines, that those kids will have to be vaccinated before they can continue their instruction in the classroom. UC Hastings School of Law professor Dorit Rice with us. She's an expert on vaccine law, and Howard Bloom, education reporter for the LA Times. And again, I welcome your input on this. Do you think that the state is going in the right direction with this? What do you think about the standards that are being applied here? Professor Rice, does it matter, the governor saying that full FDA approval would have to be granted, if the state, let's say we were in the midst of a surge, which thankfully we're not experiencing right now, but if we were, would the state have the latitude to say even just emergency use authorization, we're requiring it for students?
The state may, as we've seen, some of the school districts that are requiring vaccine are doing it even though the vaccine is under an EUA for 12 and up. There's legal uncertainty on whether you can mandate a vaccine under an emergency use authorization. I think there's a good argument that yes, you can, But the district and the state, if it does that, will be taking a legal risk because the question is not completely answered.
And there's always the question, of course, too, is this medically necessary? And Professor, should we see continuing low numbers of cases in schools, which fortunately we have seen to this point, does that make a challenge potentially more likely to succeed than if we were in the midst of a surge of cases on campus?
Marginally more likely. So the standards, the constitutional standard the courts have applied to this is a standard of reasonableness. Is it reasonable to require the vaccine? And the courts tend to defer to policymakers. And the courts continuously say you can use the mandate to prevent an outbreak, not just to stop one. So if there's a reasonable argument that the mandate will prevent outbreaks in school, the policymakers are probably on pretty good ground.
All right. Again, UC Hastings School of Law professor Dorit Rice joining us, and Howard Bloom, education reporter for the LA Times. Howard, what's going on with the status of UTLA member teachers in LA Unified being vaccinated?
They have to be completely vaccinated by October 15th. Now, this is not just teachers. This is all employees. Now, already we've heard from the union that represents most non-teaching employees, that's Local 99 of Service Employees International Union. They've asked, in essence, for an extension, saying, well, how about if we just get our first shot by October 15th instead of having both shots completed? Because if you do the math, then you really have had to have your first shot already, because even the Johnson & Johnson shot, you need 2 weeks. It's only one shot, but 2 weeks for maximum vaccine. So theoretically, the district should already be preparing to release those employees that are not vaccinated as of today, really. And they have not released the number of employees who have turned in their documentation. Now, they say, well, there's some employees, maybe a lot of employees who have been vaccinated but have not uploaded their vaccination documentation yet. And they're hoping that's what they'll find, and that a lot of people will just come through in the end. But there is a lot of concern and uncertainty at the moment.
All right, Howard, thank you so much. And as always, we appreciate your superb coverage of education in the Los Angeles Times. And Professor Rice, thank you for joining us. Such pleasure to have you with us. I'm sure we'll be in touch again soon with all that's going on with vaccines and the law.
Thank you.
That's Professor Dorit Rice, UC Hastings School of Law. She's a member of the Vaccine Working Group on Ethics and Policy. Stay tuned. The news conference from Huntington Beach on that 126,000-gallon oil leak that's affected the beaches of Huntington Beach and other parts of Orange County. We'll take you right into that when it starts.